Tonight's Devar Torah will be given by Jeff Carmel. He's a longtime member of the synagogue and a lifelong learner of Torah, and is going to be our teacher of Torah tonight. Welcome, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Sarah. Shabbat Shalom. What a joy to be here on such a beautiful summer evening, a little bit warm, but looks like everybody is enjoying. Before I start the Devar Torah, I'd like to tell you a very short story. Some years ago, if I get the right page, some years ago, my wife and daughter were about to pull out of the parking lot at Kepler's Books, and they were approached by a distraught young woman who begged them to loan her $20. She was running away from an abusive relationship, she said, and she needed the money for gas to get to a shelter. My wife, Maddie, gave her the money, and as she was about to drive away, they saw the woman with a friend in another car, laughing hysterically. Maddie turned to our daughter, Jennifer, and said, "I hope they haven't just ripped us off." Jennifer, 16 at the time, replied, "Mom, I hope they were. I would hate to think that anybody could be in such an abusive relationship that she had to beg for money to escape." Answered Maddie, "Jennifer, you are absolutely right. Who are we to judge?" Among many other things, this week's parasha deals extensively with Jewish law as it applies to charity, with the admonition that we are commanded to care for the convert, the orphan, and the widow who are in your cities, as well as for the wayfarer and the stranger. As for the poor, the parsha states, "You must open your hand for him, and if he does not want to take money from you as a gift, then lend him the money." In fact, of all the active commandments in the Torah, charity is the only one whose non-fulfillment is referred to specifically as a sin. Over the years, I've often thought about how Judaism deals with the issues of poverty, and the incident with the woman with the $20 is illustrative of a very perplexing question. What is most striking in the Jewish approach to charity is its stark difference from that of Western culture and law. Western law has a long history of actually persecuting the poor, in particular vagrants and beggars. From the earliest Western civilizations, society concluded that the beggar contributed nothing to a community and, in fact, interfered with the rights and productivity of others. Consider the biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which endeavored to solve poverty by destroying those on the bottom rung. The Talmud tells us that they enacted laws forbidding any form of charity or services to the needy, and relates numerous stories of Sodom's mistreatment of the poor and the violent penalties meted out to anyone attempting to offer a fellow human assistance or shelter. God heard the cries of the oppressed and destroyed Sodom. Unlike the barbaric people of Sodom, the seed of Abraham would perform tzedakah and build a society steeped in justice and the rule of law. Abraham was the response to Sodom. Jewish law has always protected and attempted to advance the welfare of beggars and vagrants, and this forms part of its comprehensive strategy of poverty alleviation. Jewish law's vulnerability principle has driven it to focus on the needs of the poor. Contrast this to ancient Greece, where the law held that people who lived off charity were to be punished. Plato, no less, advocated that begging be outlawed. Roman law, under the Emperor Justinian, focused the law's disapproval on able-bodied beggars, which was to become Western law's obsessions in later centuries. In other words, if a person was not disabled yet was impoverished, they could be sentenced to forced labor, exile, or worse. Throughout Europe, Up until the 19th century, Justinian law was the basis for treatment of the poor in general, but beggars and the homeless in particular, that is, vagrants, evoked both fear and contempt. For example, in 18th century France, vagrancy and begging were crimes under the law. And the sentences included being branded with a V for vagrant in the case of a homeless person, and M for mendicant in the case of a beggar. Other punishments used were public flogging, working in ships' galleys, imprisonment, and so on. In England, vagrancy was a crime, and giving anything to an able-bodied beggar was incredulously punishable by death. Young, unemployed, or homeless vagrants were put in stocks and whipped, and those over 14 were imprisoned. The United States was no better. Our Articles of Confederation denied vagrants and beggars basic rights, and every state in the Union enforced vagrancy laws against the unemployed poor. And believe it or not, as late as 1960, vagrancy was a statutory offense in every state except West Virginia. In last week's Parsha, with the Israelites poised to enter the land, Moses paints an extraordinary and poetic picture of what to expect. A land with streams and springs and fountains issuing from plain and hill, a land of wheat and barley, of vines, figs, and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, the 7 species that Rabbi Sarah last Shabbat encouraged us to eat. A land where you may eat food without stint, where you will lack nothing. Moses then, however, admonishes the people, beware lest your heart grow haughty and you forget the eternal your God. In this week's Parsha, we will read, there shall be no needy among you, since the eternal your God will bless you in the land that the eternal is giving you. But then, paradoxically, it continues, if, however, there is a needy person among you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kin. Rather, you must open your hand and lend whatever is sufficient to meet the need. A few lines on, in seeming further contradiction, Torah states, there will never cease to be destitute people in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you must open your hand to your brother, whether poor or destitute, in your land. Thus, in the very cradle of our nationhood, a land of abundance, the centrality of tzedakah in Judaism is made critically clear. The word tzedakah derives from tzedek, justice. Tzedakah, wrote Maimonides, the 12th century philosopher and Torah scholar, is not charity, but rather a much broader institution of economic justice, the aim of which is to achieve financial independence and freedom. The late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks wrote that tzedakah signifies what is often called social justice, meaning that no one should be without the basic requirements of existence, and those who have more than they need must share some of that surplus with those who have less. This is fundamental to the kind of society the Israelites were charged with creating, namely one in which everyone has a basic right to a dignified life and to be equal citizens in the covenantal community under the sovereignty of God. The society the Israelites were to construct would stand as a living contrast to what they experienced in Egypt: poverty, persecution, enslavement. Experiences Sacks stress that must never be allowed in the newly created Jewish nation. In a somewhat different commentary on tzedakah, a 5th century Midrash states, greater than the benefactor benefits the pauper benefits the benefactor. Let me repeat that. Greater than the benefactor benefits the pauper benefits the benefactor. The Midrash is recurring, of course, to the spiritual and emotional fulfillment derived by the benefactor. We give not only because there is a person in need of receiving, but also because we need to be the givers. Recall the words of Hillel, If I'm only for myself, what am I? Now here's a thought. If God wanted, God could have created a communist world where there were no rich, no poor, and no need for charity. Wouldn't this be more logical than the seemingly unfair world that God created? Well, actually, no lesser a personality than King David posed this very question to God. In a Midrash by the 4th century Talmudic sage Rabbi Tanhuma, David says to God, "Master of the universe, establish equity in your world by making rich and poor the same." God replied, "If such were the case, who would preserve kindness and truth? If all were rich and all were poor, who would be able to do acts of kindness?" And so it has been throughout Jewish history, whether in Haaretz, the land, or in the diaspora. Jews have observed the law of Torah and cared for the needy amongst them. Maimonides wrote 800 years ago, "We have never seen nor heard of a Jewish community that does not have a charity fund." Though the centralized Jewish community is largely a relic of history, the Jewish predisposition to philanthropy has not faded, wrote British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in 1993. "I have enormous admiration for the Jewish people. My old constituency of Finchley has a large Jewish population. In the 33 years I represented it, I never had a Jew come in poverty and desperation to one of my constituency surgeries. They had always been looked after by their own." Before we end, I would like to return to the issue raised at the outset in which my wife gave $20 to the woman in the parking lot. We've all been approached at one time or another by beggars, and the question that always seems front and center is whether their ask is legitimate. In other words, could they, if able-bodied, be out working for the money rather than soliciting strangers? It is certainly no surprise that the Talmud deals with this. Rav Huna said, "We investigate before giving food. We don't investigate before giving clothing." Obversely, Rav Yehuda said, "We investigate before giving clothing. We don't investigate before giving food." And from this, a whole discussion ensues. But without going into the details, the conclusion is that it's appropriate to investigate if we have a reason to believe the ask is not legitimate. On the other hand, Rabbi Yitzchak Abahav, living in Spain in the 1300s, wrote, "Do not withhold from giving tzedakah to anyone who asks. It is better to give to one who does not really need it than to refrain from giving to those who truly do need it." In many cases, we simply cannot know the truth. So better a charitable policy that benefits all, perhaps, than a miserly policy that damages all. Only if we know for sure that someone is masquerading should we withhold tzedakah. Otherwise, be wise to give. Ultimately, as Jews, we believe that God will do justice. Our duty is to give, and let God deal with those who disguise theft under the cloak of charity. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Jeff.